the Bible gives examples of how to die triumphantly. Remember, I told you every time I read through the Bible, look for something once, because I was a pastor and I had to do a lot of funerals. I went through and looked how God chronicled the death of people, the good and the bad. And here's some of the good ones. Jacob dies trusting the promises of God. You ought to read in Genesis 47 what he says. He calls God his shepherd that shepherded him all the way through his life. He said, Jacob, the patriarch, he says, God has been the shepherd I've followed all through my life. That's what he said on his deathbed to his kids gathered around him. Joseph, the one, the Prince of Egypt, Joseph, he sits in bed and blesses all of his descendants and then asks them to carry his bones to the promised land. He believed God's promises so much. That's a great account. David dies exhorting his family to follow the Lord in 1 Kings 2. Stephen dies praising God and saying, I see the Son of Man. And it says Jesus was standing at the right hand of the Father. In other words, Jesus stood up to welcome his martyr Stephen home. What a beautiful account. Paul dies, and we all know that one, finishing the course. He said, I fought a good fight. Peter says, I'm going to soon die. I want to stir you up by way of remembrance. Now, when I was a pastor, I used to encourage the congregation. I would say, you need to write out your testimony and your favorite hymns and your favorite verse so that at your funeral, someone can read how you came to Christ, your favorite parts of the Scripture, and hymns. And I started that when I was at Grace Community. When I worked for John MacArthur, my first assignment was I had 864 senior citizens. The youngest person in the class was over 65, and I had almost 900 of them in one class. That's how big the church was. And so I went to them, I said, okay, I'm going to eventually do your funeral. I'd like you to write your testimony, how you came to Christ, your favorite hymns and favorite Scripture. You know what they all said? Oh, I'm not that old. Nobody thinks they're going to die. Nobody thinks they're old enough to die. And so I began doing a funeral every week. That's how fast. I always had a couple that were on, respirators, and a couple that were in chemo, and a couple that were in ICU, and it was just amazing. Bonnie and I would be with all these dear saints as they died. And finally, one of them, the wife says, hey, my husband did what you said. Here's the paper. And he said, I want this read at my funeral. And he said, and he told his whole testimony of how he had been in the war and, someone shared the gospel with him and he came to Christ. And he said, and I am dying trusting in Jesus Christ. Well, that changed everything. When I read that at the funeral, they all got busy. They thought it was so neat to hear at their funeral, not the pastor saying this person's a Christian, but their own personal testimony read. And so I said, every song we're singing is what Bill wants us to sing. And every scripture we're reading is what Bill were his favorite. And so the example is kind of like Peter reminding the saints. He says, my time to go is soon coming, but I want you to be ready after I go. And of course, Christ died. Remember, on the cross, looking to the thief. And he actually is soul winning as he's dying. And what an example to us it is.